Welcome back to Radio Entrepreneurs. I'm Jonathan Freedman, and our next guest in the studio, Katherine Brustowicz, an associate with the Wagner Law Group. Welcome to Radio Entrepreneurs.
Thanks, Jonathan.
I know you practice employment and human resources law, and you come to us with an interesting area, and you want to talk about delicate questions. And I assume that there are a whole plethora of delicate questions and how to navigate around those. Once upon a time, you used to say, "Stay away from age," and that was simple. Now it's much more complicated. So. You want to tell us a little about your practice area and what you come up with?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I've been working with the Wagner Law Group for about 8 years now. As you said, my focus is on employment law and HR law, as well as civil litigation. And my clients are typically management side, so companies and business entities. And to your earlier point, Jonathan, we still do want to be careful when we're discussing age. So that's still one of those kind of cautious topics to navigate carefully. But I did want to talk about delicate issues that an employer may face during the recruitment and the hiring process. So I have found that this is one employment law trap that companies can sometimes fall into, typically not on purpose, but it is really avoidable once you know about it. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to discuss some of these delicate issues and how one might be able to navigate it a little bit more smoothly and more legally. So one thing right off the bat that I wanted to discuss was that the law actually presumes that everything that's discussed during an interview factored into the actual hiring decision. And a lot of employers and interviewers don't know that. So it's very, very critical that those who are conducting interviews are properly trained and that they know what is and is not permissible to ask the candidate. And one thing that I do need to just toss out there right off the bat is that this does vary somewhat from state to state. For example, in several states, it's illegal to ask what a current applicant's salary or benefits are, but in other states it's perfectly permissible. So just keep that in the back of your mind that this does vary a little bit depending upon which state you're in. And then, of course,
and if I'm not mistaken, that is there's been some recent changes in that area.
There have been. Yes, so it's a great point, Jonathan. Yeah, certain states are now hopping on board with pay transparency, where they now have to post what the actual salary range will be for open positions. In many states, we haven't been allowed to ask what the salary ranges currently are because there's a fear that that might perpetuate further inequity within pay. So for example, a lot of women are paid a little bit less than their male counterparts are. And if they tell an interviewer right off the bat, this is my salary, chances are the hiring company is going to start them off at that somewhat lower salary, which is sort of it makes sense. But so in many states, Massachusetts included, we need to just be careful not to ask what a current applicant's salary is, but instead we can say, hey, this job that you're applying for is going to be paying between X and Y. Is it a position that you're still interested in? So there are ways to kind of skirt around these questions.
So it's okay to still use what I refer to as the ballpark question as opposed to nailing down a specific number.
Yes, exactly. That's a really good way of phrasing it. So one tip that I have for kind of legally navigating the interview process is to really limit the questions that are asked during the interview process to issues that are really truly needed to evaluate the candidate's qualifications and essentially their fitness for the position. So I always tell my clients, omit fluff, just stick to what you need to know with respect to the job position itself. So Jonathan, do you remember how I mentioned that the law presumes that anything that's discussed during an interview factored into the hiring decision?
Yes.
Well, what happens if a candidate volunteers information or maybe discloses something like their religion or that they have a disability or maybe they share what their pregnancy status is?
I would imagine that those are areas that you want to redirect or stay away from.
Exactly. You're exactly right. So this can be really problematic because all those factors that I just listed, they all place the candidate into a protected class under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So the best way for an interviewer to handle that type of a disclosure is, frankly, just be upfront with the candidate. Tell them, I don't want to discuss your age. I don't want to discuss your religious beliefs or the fact that you're newly pregnant or whatever it is that the candidate has disclosed. And then you're going to want to advise the applicant that his or her status in a protected class will not be factored into the hiring decisions. And then, of great importance, you have to make sure that it really does not factor into the hiring decision. And then lastly, you're going to want to just instruct or invite the candidate to ask job-related questions or to ask questions about the company. So again, just trying to bring them back to the job itself.
So I have an interesting, well, maybe not interesting to you, but thought related to that. Very often, in the interviewing process, you'll talk about obviously the role, and what I hear you saying is that's most important. But what about past experiences in life that may impact how they come to the role, or how they view the role, or how they're employed, their background, because everybody's background weighs to some degree in how somebody may view a role or perform in a role.
Yeah.
I can ask provide you with a specific. If somebody's grew up in an environment where there was a family business, and they're applying to a position that is a non-family business, is that something that you would advise staying away from, because it's not necessarily germane to the role itself, but it is factor into how they may view the role?
Yes, that's a great question. I think with that particular example, that's perfectly fine to talk about, perfectly fine for the candidates to disclose that, because as you said, they do have some experience there that maybe it's, a little bit different because it's a family business versus a non-family business, but the general skill set that they have, the experience that they've gained, is quite pertinent potentially to the job that they are applying for. The one thing that I would say, just to kind of tread lightly about, is with respect to age, as you had raised earlier. If they say something like, oh, I graduated from high school in such and such a year, and then I immediately began working for my family company, that can get you into a little bit of hot water, because you can discern from their graduation year what their age is. And if they happen to be 40 years or older, then they are protected under ADEA. And so the employer cannot discriminate on the basis of age. And again, anything that's discussed in the interview is deemed to have gone into the actual hiring decision itself. So the
Interesting.
experience is excellent to talk about. The age, be a little bit cautious about.
Do you see situations, and maybe don't have the legal term correct, but sort of the notion of entrapment, where people are going into interviews and they know that they these types of questions are off base, but are asking those types of questions in the hope that they may bring in a prospective employer into a discrimination suit? I mean, it seems almost absurd, but I would imagine these cases
So
do
you do have to be
arise.
cautious of that. And that's why if a candidate does disclose something that puts them into a protected class, you have to try to bring them back to more job-oriented questions. You again want to say, I don't want to talk about your being part of this protected class. I don't want to talk about your religion or your national origin. That's going to have nothing to do with the hiring decision. And again, you want to make sure that it truly doesn't. You also will want to take notes during the interview to corroborate what you have or have not discussed. That way, should litigation ensue down the road, it can be exonerating. But you do have to keep in mind that your notes would be discoverable if litigation does happen. So you need to make sure that you are accurately keeping track of what actually occurred during the interview. And you can also have a second person conduct an interview as well. That way you'll have essentially more witnesses or more documentation on your side to potentially refute a candidate who perhaps wasn't hired or is litigious.
Now, another thing that I've experienced, or I've advised clients, and not from a legal perspective, obviously, but from a good best practice perspective, is you'll often find people jotting notes down on somebody's resume, and I've said, no, that is the candidate's document. Do not write anything on somebody's resume.
That's smart.
Okay, because again, that is a document they've provided, and same thing I would imagine with samples and things of that nature. If you need to make notes, make them on your own pages.
Exactly. On your own pages, you can date it. That way it's contemporaneous. It's very clear that that's your document. Just in terms of clarity and organization, it's nicer to keep them separate that way.
Excellent. Well, you've given us a whole bunch of things to think about. The world of hiring and recruiting, obviously a lot more complicated today. If people want to reach out and talk with you, Catherine, about it, if people want to have conversations, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. So I'm available by email. My email is kbrustowicz@wagnerlawgroup.com. It's K is in my first name, Katherine, Brustowicz, the last name, at wagnerlawgroup.com. And then my direct dial is 617-352-8045. And I'm more than happy to discuss any questions that you have, whether it be about employment law or HR law, civil litigation, or if you just want to brainstorm about any kind of issues that you or your company might be having, I'm certainly available.
Excellent. Katherine Brustowicz, Wagner Law Group. It's been a pleasure having you on Radio Entrepreneurs and really appreciate your insights.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
And we'll be right back with another segment on Radio Entrepreneurs.